All right. I'm actually going to read a piece of mine first that has a lot of Baldwin in it. It's from a book called The Gray Album, a book I wrote. It's subtitled On the Blackness of Blackness, and it chimes kind of nicely with what Randall was just reading. It starts with a kind of roll call of some of the, forms of praise that the book is trying to establish. This is from early on in the book, on an introduction called How Not to Be a Slave. Drum signals. The spirituals as codes for escape from slavery, folk tales or lies, the mask of dialect in capable hands, the black Rimbaud, the black Atlantic, the black electric, the big C, Charlie Parker turning Cherokee into cocoa as the birth of bebop, Richard Wright forging a note from a white man, thus allowing him to use the segregated public library, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room and its mask of whiteness, a mask also used in his essay 10,000 Gone, jazz riffs and inversions, Jimi Hendrix's feedback during his Star-Spangled Banner, Lucille Clifton's Two-Headed Woman, artist Jean-Michel Basquiat's alchemical paintings of money that then earned him money, the fugitive slave, the trickster, the root worker, blues people, the bootlegger, the numbers writer, the diva. Some might even say the pimp, the gangster, the addict, and other outlaw identities that violate and transform traditional codes of behavior. All are examples of the storying tradition, of the self-invented and pursued through a profound act of imagination. So too the slave's free pass, often forged to Eve's passage, even passing to escape the bounds of racism and the vagaries of race, and a passing on of these acts of resistance, these lies, that African-American term for folk tales, as a collective inheritance. This is not a story to pass on. Perhaps we should refer to this not as the counterfeit tradition, but as a counterfeit inheritance that indicates the manner of its being passed on down. For while it may seem derogatory or even a contradiction in terms, who would really want a false inheritance? The counterfeit tradition indicates something of the subtle ways by which black inheritance is transmitted and received. And that tradition, no matter your color or culture, is not simply something you inherit, but what you choose to keep and even more invent. Just because you need to invent it or forge and find it, after all, doesn't mean it's not there. Struggle is the third lesson of the tradition. There's a few lessons in it. James Baldwin perhaps best embodies this in his account of meeting painter Buford Delaney, whom in Baldwin's collected essays, The Price of the Ticket, he calls, quote, the first walking, living proof for me that a black man could be an artist. This is another quote from him. I had grown up with music, but now, on Buford's small black record player, I began to hear what I had never dared or been able to hear. Buford never gave me any lectures, but in his studio and because of his presence, I really began to hear Ella Fitzgerald, Ma Rainey, Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, Ethel Waters, Paul Robeson, Lena Horne, Fats Waller. He could inform me about Duke Ellington and W.C. Handy and Josh White, introduce me to Frankie Newton, and tell tall tales about Ethel Waters. And these people were not meant to be looked on by me as celebrities, but as part of Buford's life and as part of my inheritance. Such an inheritance, tall tales and all, is more than mere instruction in music. A paragraph later, Baldwin helps us further understand the ways in which trudging to Manhattan after a poorly paying job in Jersey, quote, working for the Army or the Yankee dollar. He learned from both Buford Delaney and Miss Anderson, that is, Delaney's friend, the famous opera singer Marian Anderson, the high cost involved in this transforming oneself. Quote, not only was I not born to be a slave, I was not born to hope to become the equal of the slave master. They had, the masters, incontestably the rope. In time, with enough, they would hang themselves with it. They were not to hang me. I was to see to that. If Buford and Miss Anderson were a part of my inheritance, I was part of their hope. In his introduction to this incredible gathering of essays, Baldwin indicates both the power of the tradition and the great cost of failing to discover it. He also indicates the ways in which the tradition is an active one. This birthright, not born to be a slave, is one that requires black folks' own action and imagination, or the hope of the rope-a-dope. For the elders, seeing the kid, as he is called, become part of this inheritance is both reward and hope enough. Baldwin's very newness provides hope for what went before, providing, that is, a kind of folk corollary to T.S. Eliot's notion of tradition and the individual talent, in which the tradition can be changed by what comes after. This is the next lesson. Not only does the tradition ennoble those who come after, but by following in it, one honors those who went before. And that way, we are their hope. Thanks. I'm going to read some of Notes of a Native Son, his first famous essay. It's about a different kind of inheritance of the death of his father. And I think I'll end with a short poem of mine about fathers. I don't think it needs any introduction. It's just a tremendous essay, and I can only read part of it, but I think it speaks to that inheritance and a different side of inheritance than the praise he's talking about with Buford Delaney. Notes of a Native Son. On the 29th of July in 1943, my father died. On the same day, a few hours later, his last child was born. Over a month before this, while all our energies were concentrated in waiting for these events, there had been, in Detroit, one of the bloodiest race riots of the century. A few hours after my father's funeral, while he lay and stayed in the Undertaker's Chapel, a race riot broke out in Harlem. On the morning of the 3rd of August, we drove my father to the graveyard through a wilderness of smashed plate glass. The day of my father's funeral had also been my 19th birthday. As we drove him to the graveyard, the spoils of injustice, anarchy, discontent, and hatred were all around us. It seemed to me that God himself had devised, to mark my father's end, the most sustained and brutally dissonant of codas. And it seemed to me, too, that the violence which rose all about us as my father left the world had been devised as a corrective for the pride of his eldest son. I had declined to believe in the apocalypse which had been central to my father's vision. Very well, life seemed to be saying, here is something that will certainly pass for an apocalypse until the real thing comes along. I had inclined to be contemptuous of my father for the conditions of his life, for the conditions of our lives. When his life had ended, I had begun to wonder about that life and also, in a new way, to be apprehensive about my own. I had not known my father very well. We had got on badly, partly because we shared in our different fashions the vice of stubborn pride. When he was dead, I realized that I had hardly ever spoken to him. When he had been dead a long time, I began to wish I had. It seemed to be typical of life in America, where opportunities, real and fancied, are thicker than anywhere else on the globe, that the second generation has no time to talk to the first. No one, including my father, seems to have known exactly how old he was, but his mother had been born during slavery. He was of the first generation of freemen. He, along with thousands of other Negroes, came north after 1919, and I was part of that generation which had never seen the landscape of what Negroes sometimes call the old country. He had been born in New Orleans and had been quite a young man there during the time that Louis Armstrong, a boy, was running errands for the dives and honky-tonks of what was always presented to me as one of the most wicked of cities. To this day, whenever I think of New Orleans, I also helplessly think of Sodom and Gomorrah. My father never mentioned Louis Armstrong except to forbid us to play his records. But there was a picture of him on our wall for a long time. One of my father's strong-willed female relatives had placed it there and forbade my father to take it down. He never did, but he eventually maneuvered her out of the house, and when, some years later, she was in trouble and near death, he refused to do anything to help her. He was, I think, very handsome. I gather this from photographs and from my own memories of him, dressed in his Sunday best and on his way to preach a sermon somewhere when I was little. Handsome, proud, and ingrown, like a toenail, somebody said. But he looked to me as I grew older like pictures I had seen of African tribal chieftains. He really should have been naked with war paint on and barbaric mementos standing among spears. He could be chilling in the pulpit and indescribably cruel in his personal life, and he was certainly the most bitter man I have ever met. Yet, it must be said that there was something else in him, buried in him, which lent him his tremendous power and even a rather crushing charm. It had something to do with his blackness, I think. He was very black. With his blackness and his beauty, and with the fact that he knew that he was black, but did not know that he was beautiful. He claimed to be proud of his blackness, but it had also been the cause of much humiliation, and it had fixed bleak boundaries to his life. He was not a young man when we were growing up, and he had already suffered many kinds of ruin. In his outrageously demanding and protective way, he loved his children who were black like him and menaced like him. And all these things sometimes showed in his face when he tried, never to my knowledge with any success, to establish contact with any of us. When he took one of his children on his knee to play, the child always became fretful and began to cry. When he tried to help one of us with our homework, the absolutely unabating tension which emanated from him caused our minds and our tongues to become paralyzed, so that he, scarcely knowing why, flew into a rage, and the child, not knowing why, was punished. If it ever entered his head to bring a surprise home for his children, it was almost unfailingly the wrong surprise. And even the big watermelons he often brought home on his back in the summertime led to the most appalling scenes. I do not remember in all those years that one of his children was ever glad to see him come home. From what I was able to gather of his early life, it seemed that this inability to establish contact with other people had always marked him and had been one of the things which had driven him out of New Orleans. There was something in him, therefore, groping and tentative, which was never expressed and which was buried with him. One saw it most clearly when he's facing new people and hoping to impress them, but he never did, not for long. We went from church to smaller and more improbable church. He found himself in less and less demand as a minister, and by the time he died, none of his friends had come to see him for a long time. He had lived and died in an intolerable bitterness of spirit, and it frightened me as we drove him to the graveyard through those unquiet, ruined streets to see how powerful and overflowing this bitterness could be, and to realize that this bitterness now was mine. The end of that essay, he talks this beautiful way about acceptance, and I feel I should read that. It began to seem one would have to hold in the mind forever two ideas which seemed to be in opposition. The first idea was acceptance, the acceptance totally without rancor of life as it is and men as they are, In the light of this idea, it goes without saying that injustice is a commonplace. But this did not mean that one could be complacent, for the second idea was of equal power, that one must never, in one's own life, accept these injustices as commonplace, but must fight them with all one's strength. This fight begins, however, in the heart, and now it had been laid to my charge to keep my own heart free of hatred and despair. This intimation made my heart heavy, and now that my father was irrevocable, I wished that he had been beside me so that I could have searched his face for the answers which only the future would give me now. The guy can write. So I'll end real quickly with a poem of mine about that heart, I suppose. My father's. When my father died, I gave away many of his organs, which he would have wanted. He had been a doctor, but not his heart, I don't think. This is called Flag Day. Oh, how I want to waste my heart on things that don't matter much. You dead 2 months about, and still the light shining off your bald head. How I wish I could leave or forget all my dead. This morning, after nights so hot I couldn't quite sleep, rose up to rain and a steady cool like a tomb. Tonight the sky swimming above a trout, blue-gray and shimmery we once caught. Cut open the pink fish flesh of the sunset. To waste all I want. To know no more of midnight, of ordering stones and choosing plots, of giving all your insides away. See them spread like the innards of your house up for auction across your browning yard. To waste this heart once more and have you here, not silent, only quiet as before. Thank you.